So I want to make sure that we do section 3 in particular, because that one, of course, is connected to the triad. So we had this first question, why is slavery, and just so you know, by the way, if the question's not, I'm only going on the bold ones because that's the question students ask me. Like I ask people to email me questions and I bold all the ones you emailed and then I got the PowerPoints ready. And I will post these PowerPoints. Why is slavery difficult to define? What were the characteristics of African slavery? How did Islamic and European demand for slavery transform it in Africa? So slavery is very complex because it's practiced differently in different civilizations and cultures. So for example, I gave you the example, the Romans didn't care what race you were. They would make you their slave, right? They didn't care, right? Remember, they admired the Greeks, and they admired the Greeks so much that they would enslave Greeks and make them teach Greek to their kids, right? That's different. The slavery as practiced in the United States was based on race. Only people that were of African descent could be enslaved. If you were of European descent, you could not become a slave. And it was understood to be what they would say in perpetuity, right? If you were a slave, your kids would be slaves, and their kids would be slaves, and their kids would be slaves. African slavery was very different, usually because it was, for one thing, it was usually people of the same race, but they were different ethnic groups or tribes or states that would have a war, and whoever lost would end up being enslaved. But what's key is over time, the slaves were usually integrated into the household. So in your own lifetime, you might cease being a slave. And even if you stayed a slave your whole life, usually your kids would not be slaves. Over time, they would become integrated into the household and just become a member of the family in a sense. What happened, though, was that they occasionally would sell surplus slaves to Islamic and later European countries, which practiced a much more brutal kind of slavery than African slavery. And what happened was the demand was so high that they would go from just selling surplus slaves to actually having war, that the purpose of which was to get slaves. And that's when you'd have slave raiding and things like that. Now, why do people engage in slavery and the slave trade despite its cruelty? The answer, I wish it was complex in a sense, because I'd like to figure out some way to make better sense of this, but it's basically because you could get a lot of money, right? People were willing to engage in this because they could make huge amounts of money. The example I gave was that if you could afford a plantation in Jamaica that would yield, and you invested like about $2,000 pounds, that's British money, every year after that you would get your investment back. So that's 100% return on your investment every year. There's no way to make that kind of money legally or even illegally today. What were the characteristics of the Dutch East Indies Company? What was its relationship to the state? So the Dutch East Indies Company, first of all, I have to emphasize, was a state-sponsored company. Right? We're used to thinking that business and states should be separate. That's not the case here. This was a state-sponsored company. Right? So the government was closely connected to this. Remember, it was established to engage in spice trading because that was a high-demand crop where you could make a lot of money because spices are very light and you can get a whole bunch of them in a ship. And what's interesting about this was, of course, this is very dangerous to sail a ship to Indonesia to buy the spices or to purchase them. So they ended up sharing the risk by having the state-sponsored company act as a corporation. So you bought a share in the corporation, right? So I want to invest $100 in this corporation and buy $100 worth of shares. That's fine. I will get the profit, a share of the profit, equivalent to how many shares I purchased. But also, I can't lose more money than I invested. And I can choose to invest just what I know I can afford to lose. And this is a big deal because it allows businesses to be able to raise vast sums of money. Right? You don't have to you don't have to have a huge amount of money to get engaged in this. And you don't have to take a whole bunch of risk, right? I can choose how much I'm going to invest. I can't lose more than I invest. So this is amazing, right? This state-sponsored company allows for this kind of innovation where businesses can very efficiently raise resources. Right? They can very efficiently raise resources. And what's also key, they even develop a stock market, right, where you sell these shares. You can't just return them to the company. So this is very modern, like I said, a very efficient way of bringing resources. What were the characteristics of the Protestant Reformation, the rise of centralized states? So there was a lot of corruption in the Catholic Church in the 15th and early 16th century. That's going to lead to Martin Luther to start the Protestant Reformation. That will lead to wars between Catholics and Protestants. And the question someone might ask is, who won, the Protestants or the Catholics? And my answer is, the governments. right? This is going to lead to the governments becoming increasingly powerful. Governments will establish control over churches, and this is a big deal because in Europe at this time, a lot of times a church had more money than the government, right? A lot of times the church would have even twice as much money than the government. So that gave the government a lot more money, and governments become better at collecting taxes. They'll form these centralized governments to collect taxes because you need those for wars, right? You can't win a war unless you can raise taxes to get soldiers. The states who can do this will become really big. They'll absorb smaller states and become even more powerful. And this will lead to two kinds of centralized states. Remember, there's the French one, exemplified by Louis XIV, based around divine right and royal absolutism, and the British one based around ideas of liberty and freedom. And that feeds perfectly into number 18. Why did the centralized state of England, remember that's the one connected to democracy and liberty, defeat the centralized state of France in the 7 Years' War? And this was striking to people, right? Because France had like twice the economic size as Britain, bigger army, bigger navy. But the English win a large part for economic reasons. Remember, the French government was divine right, royal absolutist. The French government told people what to do. It could force you to loan money to the government, but it wouldn't necessarily pay it back. And when I gave the government money, I didn't really have a say in how that money was spent. So French people were not particularly interested in loaning their government much money because, like I said, it doesn't give them an option in how it's spent, and it may not pay it back. However, the British were able, through the sale of bonds, which are basically like loans that the government takes out from its people, were able to raise a huge amount of money and build up its army navy strong enough to beat the French. Why? Well, in England, more people had a say in their government. People are therefore more willing to trust their government. If I have a say in how taxes are collected, how much taxes are collected, and how those taxes are spent, I'm much more willing to pay taxes, and I'm much more willing to loan the government money. Right? I trust the government, and also because I know that the government, if an elected official tries not to pay me back the money I loaned them, that person will not be reelected. Right? We'll elect someone else who will pay us back. So democracy leads to trust. We only loan money to people we trust, and England can therefore raise a lot more money to build up its army and navy, despite being smaller than France. What was the key idea connected to Copernicus? How did he develop? How was he connected to religion? So this goes to our theme. We were talking about science. I mean, very simply, what he's famous for doing is figuring out that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. I mean, that's the kind of basic thing he's famous for. But one thing I wanted people to understand, in particular, was that he didn't do this as a single genius. He did this working in a group of scientists, right, united together in this kind of scholarly network. I also want to emphasize that Copernicus was himself a priest. He was not anti-religious, but he didn't publish his book about this Earth going around the sun thing until he was almost dead, because he was afraid of what might happen to him, right? Because some religious people in Europe were hostile to science. So that's one key thing, was that some forms of religion and science get along, others do not. But in the Christian world, the people who believe that science and religion go together, those people win out. And a big person who did that, it's much more dramatic when my clicker works, there we go. The key person who did that we talk about in this class is Isaac Newton, right? Isaac Newton. So how does he contribute to the development of science? How do you see the relationship between science and religion? And how did he view humanity and the universe? So first of all, Isaac Newton lived in England, a place that was very open to science, and he was interested in physics, especially motion. And he was using astronomy to understand how planets moved. Right? He was wanting to understand the laws of motion that impact planets. And he figured out that the same laws that impact the planets impact motion on Earth. Right? Especially things like cannon. Right? He could figure out, and a lot of these experiments involved the idea of a cannon shooting a cannonball out and how it would move. In terms of religion, he brought them together. He said there are things called scientific laws. These laws were put into place by God, the divine lawmaker. And if we use our reason, which was given to us by God, to understand God's laws, we are understanding the mind of God and becoming closer to God. Isn't that awesome? Right? He saw these things as going together, no problem. So he had a very optimistic view of the universe and people's ability to use their God-given reason to bring unlimited progress. Right? We human beings are awesome. We live in this amazing, orderly universe that God created, which is governed by laws that we can understand and use to benefit ourselves. And that relates to the next person. Well, two more people. How did Frederick turn science into power? Remember, Frederick was a Prussian which is modern-day Germany. We're going to talk about it later. It unifies Germany. But Frederick was a king of Prussia, and he realized that with advanced science, he could develop powerful, accurate artillery. Right? If you apply Newton's laws of physics to artillery, you can figure out, before you fire your artillery, where the shell is going to land. You don't have to guess. You can figure out where it's going to land. That gives you a big advantage. Right? So he's going to apply science to develop this kind of new technology, right? Accurate artillery. Another example of someone who I talked a lot about who is going to do this kind of thing is Adam Smith. Right? Adam Smith is going to try and use science to understand society, and we talked about this through his ideas on market, specialization, and tariffs. So, first of all, Adam Smith says, you know what, these guys like Isaac Newton and such, these guys are geniuses. Right? They're understanding how the world works through science. Maybe human beings also operate according to scientific laws. Right? Maybe we human beings, our behavior goes along scientific laws. So he's going to take this idea of discovering laws, but apply it to human behavior, in his case, the economy. Right? He's going to apply it to the economy. And he studies, and he says, you know what? Free markets determine prices and allocate goods more efficiently than anything else. So, for example, more efficiently than the government. Right? If the government comes in and says, you know what, I think strawberries are too expensive, we're going to put a price limit and make strawberries have a low price, he shows scientifically, through gathering data and through charts and so forth, that would lead to a shortage. Farmers will stop producing strawberries if they can't make enough money from them. Right? He will also argue that in this thing called comparative advantage, everyone will win when we specialize and then trade. Your country should do what it does best, my country should do what I do best, and we trade what we have, and then we get the best of both worlds. Right? Your country's good at producing wine, my country's good at producing wool. You make all the wine, I'll make all the wool, we'll trade our surplus, we'll get really good wine and really good wool. And this is important because he's really challenging mercantilism. Mercantilism says we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't trade freely. And mercantilism says it's win-lose. If you have the gold mine, if you have the sugarcane land, then you win, I lose. But he says, no, we can both win. The economy doesn't have to be a win-lose situation. We can both win. That's one of his basic ideas. But notice, he's applying science to the economy, and based on what he's figuring out, he is saying we should take particular political stances. We should have particular policies that the government should follow. Right? You should not have tariffs. You should not fix prices. I know this scientifically, and that should shape how our politics works. And this goes to this question 26 about the Enlightenment. What was it? Where was it centered? What was being criticized by Enlightenment thinkers of France? How did Catherine the Great apply Enlightenment ideas in Russia? Who was left out of these developments in Russia? How did she justify this? What is an enlightened despot? So in France, the Enlightenment is centered in France. And you may remember in that video clip, even though it was aristocrats who kind of start the Enlightenment, they're getting criticized on it on the grounds of equality. Right? People say, why should you be in charge just because your dad was an aristocrat? Why should we have a king just because his dad was king? Why should we do that? That doesn't make sense. So they emphasize equality. Remember, the French Revolution was about liberty, equality, fraternity. Right? So that's what they're criticizing there. Catherine the Great is interesting because she's also enlightened. Remember, she's building all these towns that are meant to be built along scientific principles. They have like hospitals and schools and modern sewer systems. But she leaves out the peasants, right? Or the serfs. She treats the serfs almost as property. Remember, she gives them away to people that she likes. So in her case, she's enlightened, but she doesn't believe in equality. She says, oh, I am enlightened, I'm reasonable, therefore I get to tell people what to do. So she's an enlightened despot. What changed after the American Revolution? What stayed the same? What tensions existed? Why did democracy allow religious tolerance? So in the American Revolution, we had a massive radical political revolution. We went from having a monarchy, constitutional monarchy, to a republic. So that's radical. But society and the economy kind of stayed the same. If you were on top of society or the economy before the revolution, you probably were as well after the revolution. Right? And in particular, you can see the conservative nature of this revolution. And even though it was about liberty, it excluded people of African descent. Right? Slaves stayed slaves. So that was a problem. Now, one interesting thing, though, about the revolution is it also democracy allows religious tolerance. Because in democracy, sovereignty comes from the people. But in a monarchy, typically, sovereignty comes from God. Right? So Louis XIV, he wanted everyone to be Catholic. He didn't trust Protestants. Because he said, why are they Protestant? They should be Catholic like me. I'm the king, right? And God chose me, so they should just be Catholic. By being Protestants, that's kind of weird. So he didn't kill the Protestants, but he put certain restrictions on them. But democracy allows you to get away from